This is the Music History In-Depth podcast for March 12th through the 18th. On this week's show, a country music group finds out the cost of free speech, a guitar legend leaves a band and starts a chain of events, the father of rock and roll passes away, and one of rap music's most important acts debuts. This show goes more in depth about some of the events that we put on our daily podcast, the Music History Today podcast, which drops every single day, including weekends, wherever you get your podcast from. Now, on to this week's episode. I've said before that this podcast is not about personal politics or racial matters for that matter, but that sometimes those things and music do mix, especially the politics and the music. So we do on occasions have to talk about them. This story would be one of those times when politics and music mixed. It's also an example of the fact that both conservatives and liberals love cancel culture, even as they rail against the other side's use of it. And it is also an example of how free speech sometimes isn't free, and that rightly or wrongly, it will carry consequences that you will not anticipate. In response to the attack on the United States on September 11, 2001, the United States, led by President George W. Bush, ex-governor of the state of Texas, invaded Afghanistan. The Texas part is important to the story, as you'll see in a minute. Before 9/11, Bush had endured 8 months of halfway decent poll numbers after a highly contested election where he lost the popular vote to then Vice President Al Gore, but won the Electoral College. Sounds kind of familiar. After the attacks on September 11th, patriotism was at an all-time high as people rallied around the president, making him very popular. In the first few months after the invasion, there were signs put out in the press that other countries would soon feel the wrath of the United States. There was talk that some countries had weapons of mass destruction, and the leaders of said countries needed to be taken out in what was then called regime change. The main country squarely in the United States' crosshairs, Iraq. Iraq at the time was led by dictator Saddam Hussein. Hussein was no angel by anybody's stretch of the imagination. He murdered his own people and had invaded Kuwait a decade earlier, only to be beaten back by a coalition that was led by George W.'s father, then President George H.W. Bush. Because of that, Hussein also attempted to have George H.W. assassinated after H.W. had left the presidency, only to have that plan discovered. During the next year after 9/11, a case for an invasion of Iraq was built. The United States went to the United Nations to seek a resolution for invasion. The PR campaign was built around the taking back of Kuwait, which was over and done in a few months. Quick in, quick out, done. In the beginning of the invasion of Iraq, it certainly looked that that was the way it was going to go. The United States quickly overwhelmed the Iraqi troops, and the war was, at that time, pretty popular with the American people. Now, remember that in order for you to understand music history, sometimes you have to understand the mindset of the times, and that is why I gave you all of that information. It's not so I can spout my opinion of the war, because at this point, my opinion really doesn't matter. It was 20 years ago by now. No, it's actually so that you know why what happened next actually happened. This is also where we get the musical connection from. There were some people, mainly outside of the United States at that time, who the war was not really popular with. The people of Great Britain, for instance. The Americans who spoke out against the war paid a really heavy price. Think of this as that version of the Israeli-Palestinian war of its day, basically. The same opinions that get people in trouble now are the same basic opinions that got people in trouble then. If you took what was perceived as the wrong side, you paid a price. For instance, actresses Susan Sarandon and Janine Garofalo and actor Tim Robbins all suffered severe backlash, as did this next group. The Dixie Chicks, now known as the Chicks, were riding high in the early 2000s. They were one of the biggest country music acts with hits like Wide Open Spaces. They were on tour in Great Britain in 2003 when the war was at its beginning and it looked like it would be a quick over and done. Before their concert on March 10th, 2003 in London, singer Natalie Maines gave an interview to the Guardian newspaper columnist Betty Clark, who was reviewing the concert. In the interview, Natalie Maines said, quote, "Just so you know, we're on the good side with y'all. We do not want this war, this violence, and we're ashamed the President of the United States is from Texas." End quote. That's where the Texas part was important. On March 12th, 2003, The Guardian published the review, but condensed what Natalie said to, quote, "Just so you know, we're ashamed the President of the United States is from Texas," end quote. Honestly, I don't even think it mattered either way if the middle part of what she said was cut out or not. But once word got out about it, reaction was swift, and it was brutal. Country music fans called into radio stations demanding that they stop playing the Dixie Chicks songs. Radio DJs called for not only boycotting their songs, but for people to not even buy their albums. There were album-crushing parties where the people brought Dixie Chicks CDs to be crushed by steamrollers. Other musicians joined in on the anti-Dixie Chicks bandwagon, the late Toby Keith, for instance. Some musicians, like Bruce Springsteen and Merle Haggard, stood up and publicly supported them, although they did not suffer much backlash for doing it. I mean, it's Springsteen. It's like going up against Taylor Swift these days. You're really not going to win that battle, people. For the rest of the Dixie Chicks tour that year, a lot of their tour sponsors actually backed out after getting backlash from people. Big radio stations blacklisted the Dixie Chicks for years. Their career sputtered to less than a crawl. It was actually just stopped dead in its tracks. For his part, when asked about what the Dixie Chicks said, President Bush responded, quote, "The Dixie Chicks are free to speak their mind. They can say what they want to say. They shouldn't have their feelings hurt just because some people don't want to buy their records when they speak out. Freedom is a two-way street. I don't really care what the Dixie Chicks said. I want to do what I think is right for the American people, and if some singers or Hollywood stars feel like speaking out, that's fine. That's the great thing about America." End quote. Now, you would think that the story ends right there. It doesn't. Because after enduring a few years of being pretty much blacklisted by corporate radio, yet another reason why corporate media consolidation was a really bad idea, by the way, and after it became rather apparent that the Iraq War wasn't exactly going according to plan and was actually becoming increasingly unpopular, especially in America, the Dixie Chicks came storming back. In 2006, they put out an album called Taking the Long Way, which produced the autobiographical song I'm Not Ready to Make Nice. The song went on to win Song and Record of the Year at the following year's Grammy Awards, while the album won Album of the Year. They also put out a documentary called Shut Up and Sing, which chronicled the 3-year period from them actually singing the national anthem at the 2003 Super Bowl on through to all the commentary backlash. The film itself received some backlash as certain movie theaters refused to show it. The distributor of the movie said, quote, "It's a sad commentary about the level of fear in our society that a movie about a group of courageous entertainers who were blacklisted for exercising their right of free speech is now itself being blacklisted by corporate America." End quote. That distributor, by the way, was Harvey Weinstein, who ironically had been using fear and intimidation to allegedly sexually harass and rape women for years until he himself was taken down by a New Yorker magazine article in 2017, which helped to jumpstart the hashtag #MeToo movement. But that, like politics, is for a whole other podcast. The Guardian newspaper article that started the backlash against the Dixie Chicks, published on March 12, 2003. Before we go any further, we'd like to tell you about our other podcasts. The Music History Today podcast goes over the daily events in music history and drops daily, including weekends, on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. There's also the Music Halls of Fame podcast, which talks about a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, along with other Music Halls of Fame's museums and walks of fame. The Music Halls of Fame podcast drops every Thursday and can also be found on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to this podcast. Sometimes an organization has a culture that breeds success, either by skill or by luck. In basketball, for instance, a recent example would be the San Antonio Spurs, who have their current Hall of Fame coach, Greg Popovich. From Pops, you have his ex-assistant and now three-time championship coach of the Golden State Warriors, Mr. Steve Kerr, as well as another of his ex-assistants, former female NBA assistant coach, ex-WNBA All-Star player, and current championship coach of the two-time defending champions, the Las Vegas Aces, Hall of Famer herself, Miss Becky Hammon, among Pops' many other successful ex-assistants and staff members. It's that culture of excellence that he demands that breeds excellence, but it took him being hired to have the dominoes fall in that direction. In music, it works a little different. Sometimes it's a city's musical culture that does it. Think Seattle in the late 1980s and how many great bands all worked together to make each other better and to pull each other up. Then there's the group the Yardbirds, who either bred talent or were just really, really good at spotting it, especially when it came to their guitarists. Sometimes the system works the opposite way and one person leaves an organization, which leads to a chain of events where other great artists take over, connections are made, which leads to other great bands and careers being born. This next case would be an example of the latter, and we will circle back to the Yardbirds. The Yardbirds started in the early 1960s and took over the house band gig from the Rolling Stones at the famous Crawdaddy Club in London, England. Top Topham was their original lead guitarist, but when he left the band, they got some 18-year-old kid named Eric Clapton. Clapton was interested in playing American blues, and in the beginning, the Yardbirds seemed to be too, having first made a name for themselves by touring England in support of bluesman Sonny Boy Williamson. Clapton, however, was not really happy with the way that the Yardbirds were slowly going, at least musically. The band, influenced a little by the Beatles, probably more than a little by the Beatles, started going towards pop and less towards the blues. Clapton was a blues purist. He wanted to be in a blues band. The Yardbirds had recorded a song called For Your Love, a Beatles-influenced pop song. Clapton by then had seen enough. On March 13th, 1965, Eric Clapton left the Yardbirds, although it wasn't officially announced until March 25th. For Your Love, just for the record, actually became a huge hit for the band, so you know. Here is where the excellence tree started growing musical branches. First, the Yardbirds had Eric Clapton. When Clapton was leaving, he recommended a guitarist named Jimmy Page. Page was asked to join. Page said no, surprisingly. The Yardbirds then found a guy by the name of Jeff Beck. Beck was there for a couple of years. Then Page suddenly decided that he wanted to be in the Yardbirds, especially since they were having a lot of success with their pop sound. So for a while, the band actually had both Page and Beck playing for them. Something eventually had to give, so the band ended up firing not Page, but Beck. The band itself ended up disbanding in 1968. So, what happened to all of these people? Well, let's start with Clapton. He went on to become a member of John Mayall and the Blues Breakers. Then he formed the group Cream, and then Derek and the Dominoes, and then Blind Faith, before finally going on to have an immensely successful solo career. He has been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 4 times, 3 as a member of 3 of those groups. That is actually a pretty good success branch right there. But wait, there's more. Jeff Beck went on to form his own group called, in a form of divine creativity, the Jeff Beck Group. All right, it wasn't really divine creativity. He just had to come up with a name. He had in his group a lead singer who was in the group The Small Faces and also would end up having a Hall of Fame solo career named Rod Stewart. He also had a bass player by the name of Ronnie Wood who would go on to join the Rolling Stones. Jimmy Page would go on to form a little indie group of its own, some garage band called Led Zeppelin. They were actually formed as an offshoot of the last lineup of the Yardbirds that was around in 1968. Now, some would say that all of those groups, as important as they were, would have gotten together eventually. I beg to differ. If Clapton had stayed with the Yardbirds during their run, then at the very least he would not have joined John Mayall, invented Cream, Derek and the Dominoes, and Blind Faith. Maybe later on in the game, like in the 70s. That right there is 4 classic rock groups that would have been, if they had been formed, average at best without him. Plus, if he had recorded Layla with the Yardbirds, I highly doubt it would have been as good, just speaking honestly. Beck and Page may have gone on to do other things, but they probably wouldn't have been as good. For instance, had Page had not been in the Yardbirds when he was, then he may not have met Robert Plant, John Bonham, and John Paul Jones, and Led Zeppelin might have been meh, instead of being one of the most important groups ever assembled in rock music history. No, it actually took Clapton's leaving to put all those pieces into action. Sometimes the world just works in mysterious ways, and it does it with a reason in mind. In San Antonio's case, Greg Popovich had to be hired for all those dominoes to work. In Clapton's case, he had to leave. Eric Clapton leaving the Yardbirds and unknowingly changing the musical landscape for at least a couple generations on March 13th, 1965. Now, our first honorable mention of this podcast also has to do with leaving. On March 13th, 2006, R&B icon Isaac Hayes, who wrote the music for the 1971 movie Shaft, quit his role as chef on the TV show South Park after the show made fun of his religion, which at the time was Scientology. The show then dealt with the chef character by having him brainwashed by a cult, and after the South Park boys tried to rescue him, Chef decided to stay with the cult, but then fell into a ravine and was mauled to death by a bunch of animals. Hell hath no fury than a bunch of animators who were really pissed off at somebody. As for Isaac Hayes himself, he ended up passing away from a stroke on August 10, 2008, 10 days before his 66th birthday. Isaac Hayes leaving South Park, March 13th, 2006. Some more honorable mentions before we continue. First up, on March 17, 1967, one of the greatest rock songs ever recorded was released when the Jimi Hendrix Experience released their song Purple Haze in the United Kingdom. On March 12, 1955, the world lost one of the greatest jazz saxophonists who ever lived. His life was given the biopic treatment in 1988 with the Clint Eastwood-directed movie Bird, starring Forrest Whitaker as the acclaimed jazz icon, Charlie Bird Parker, who passed away from pneumonia and a bleeding ulcer on March 12, 1955. On March 16, 1995, rapper Eazy-E of Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees NWA announced that he was HIV positive, becoming one of the first hip-hop stars to publicly announce having the AIDS virus, as the virus was still being stigmatized as being a, quote, gay disease, end quote, or as some conservatives said, quote, God's punishment for homosexual behavior, end quote. Eazy-E was diagnosed with the disease on February 26th while in the hospital for a different reason and blamed getting the disease on a female former lover. Eazy-E passed away from AIDS-related complications on March 26, 1995, a month after he found out that he had the disease. Here's one for you true crime detectives out there. Ephraim Lewis was a British up-and-coming neo-soul singer in the early 1990s. He released one album, 1992's Skin, which had the hit song Drowning in Your Eyes. In 1994, Ephraim was living in Los Angeles, California. On March 18, 1994, Los Angeles police were called to Ephraim's apartment because of a report about, quote, a naked black man acting crazy, end quote. When police found Lewis, he fled by climbing up the balconies of his building up to the fourth floor, according to a police report. Police said that they confronted Lewis on that fourth floor balcony where they tased him 3 times. Also, according to the police report, the tasers had little to no effect on him, even though they were pretty much embedded into his skin. According to police, Lewis then fell from the balcony to the ground where he sustained severe head injuries, and he was taken to the hospital where he died later that night at the age of 26. The coroner listed his death as, quote, a suicide, end quote. However, there's a bunch of unanswered questions about what happened that Lewis's relatives have actually tried to get answered. However, at last check, the LAPD has declined to ever investigate their own department's actions. For instance, was Ephraim on drugs? Was he taking too much medication, the wrong medication, or was he having a complete mental breakdown episode? Does happen. What happened on that balcony that required the guy to get tased 3 times? I am not in any way saying that the police forced him over the edge. Literally, not even accusing the LAPD of forcibly pushing the dude over the edge. But after getting tased 3 times, was his fall actually a suicide, as the coroner said? Or was he disoriented from being tased and accidentally fell over the balcony? An inquiry should literally be done about this now, even though we're on the 30th anniversary of his unfortunate tragedy, and at least bring some closure to the family. The death of singer Ephraim Lewis in Los Angeles, California, on March 18, 1994. On March 17, 2020, New York City bars, restaurants, nightclubs, and concert venues all shut down as COVID-19 lockdowns took effect. Bars and restaurants were restricted to takeout and pickup only. The rest of the city and the state officially shut down on March 22nd. And other cities and states had their restricted movements right around that same exact time period. Now, someone once asked me if I could build a Mount Rushmore of musical acts, who would be on it? I said that you can't do one for music overall because there are too many people who have helped to shape the genre. You would have to build one for each time period and for each type of music. For instance, for classical music, I would have put Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart automatically up there, with the number 4 spot probably being up for debate. For the early part of rock and roll, i.e. from the mid-1950s until, say, 1960, I would have to put Elvis, Fats Domino, and Little Richard. However, I would also have to put this man front and center in terms of crafting rock and roll and giving it its attitude. Chuck Berry was born on October 18, 1926 in St. Louis, Missouri. From the beginning, Chuck was interested in music. He performed during high school, but once he got out of high school, he settled into normal life, got married, and worked in an assembly plant assembling cars. He still had the music bug, though, so he started performing with the Johnny Johnson Trio. It was there that he honed his showmanship skills, having studied what T-Bone Walker was doing on stage. One day in May of 1955, Berry went to Chicago, Illinois. He happened to meet the great Muddy Waters, who told him to have a talk with Leonard Chess of Chess Records. Chess took a look at Berry. They saw that rhythm and blues was beginning to go down in popularity, and they were looking to stretch their sound into new genres, and they thought that Chuck Berry might be the person to actually help them do that. Berry took a country song called Ida Red, reworked it, and recorded it. He changed the name to Maybelline, and it became a huge hit. He had a bunch of hits in the first decade of his career, from Johnny Be Good to No Particular Place to Go to Roll Over Beethoven to rock and roll music. Berry geared his music towards teenagers. He talked about good times, cars, girls, and fun. His stage act became legendary, especially when he bent down and hopped across the stage on one leg, which became known as the duck walk. He made a good living with his touring. In short, he became the template for other artists to copy. As with most artists, with the good, of course, comes the bad. Berry was busted as a child for armed robbery. In 1962, he served 1.5 years of a 3-year sentence for transporting a minor across state lines, although some people believe that it was a made-up charge based on racism. He also, later in life, got caught for tax evasion and was also sued for filming women changing their clothes in a bathroom. The latter charge he denied, but the suit was settled out of court. Chuck continued to play almost 100 shows a year worldwide, and then cut back to playing at least once a month at a local restaurant near St. Louis, Missouri, where he lived. Chuck Berry lived to be 90 years old, passing away on March 18th, 2017. Today, he's considered to be one of the great pioneers of rock and roll. When the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted its first class in 1986, Chuck Berry's name was front and center on the first ballot. On Rolling Stone magazine's Greatest Artists of All Time list, he is ranked at number 5. 6 of his songs made Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Songs of All Time list, with Johnny Be Good being the highest at number 7. Johnny Be Good is also the only rock and roll song that was put on the gold record on the Voyager spacecraft that is now at the edge of the solar system. Father of rock and roll indeed. Chuck Berry, passing away at the age of 90 on March 18th, 2017. We can't leave this podcast on such a downer, so how about we talk about the debut of a pioneering hip-hop group? The original nicknames to this group were DJ Run, Don of Curtis Blow, Easy D, and Jazzy Jace. In the early 1980s, there were 3 kids who grew up in Hollis, Queens. Joseph Simmons had an older brother named Russell, who was a hip-hop promoter and had started a record label with his college roommate, Rick Rubin. The record label was called Def Jam Records. Russell, at the time, promoted rapper Curtis Blow and needed someone to be Curtis's DJ. Joseph was recruited to be the DJ, but soon, Joseph wanted to rap. Russell let Joseph record one song, which went absolutely nowhere. In the meantime, Joseph had a friend called Daryl McDaniel. The two of them wanted to rap as a duo. At first, Russell said no because he didn't like Daryl's rap style, but he eventually said yes. They needed a DJ, though, so they got their friend Jason Mizell. Russell then changed all their nicknames. Joseph DJ Run, son of Curtis Blow, became Run. Daryl Easy D became DMC, and Jason Jazzy Jace became Jam Master J, and the group became known as Run DMC. For the record, they all actually hated the name of the group, but it kind of grew on them. They signed to Profile Records and released their first single, It's Like That, on March 12th, 1983, with the B-side Sucker MCs. The song was written by the group and was produced by rap legend Curtis Blow, along with Eli Tubo. The song hit number 15 on the R&B charts for Billboard magazine. In 1997, house DJ Jason Nevins released a dance remix of the song. The remix went top 10 in 19 different countries, including hitting number 1 in 13 different countries, mainly in Europe, because the remix only got as high as number 13 on the American singles chart. After the success of their debut single, they released their first album, Run DMC, in 1984. That album had hits like Hard Times, along with the transcending song Rockbox, with their mixture of hip-hop and hard rock, complete with the blistering guitar of session musician Eddie Paul Martinez. The song Rockbox was one of the first to combine what were, at least at that point, two completely separate worlds: black inner-city hip-hop and white suburban heavy metal. Both were considered dangerous in the eyes of the mainstream, i.e. mainstream American parents, that is, which made them a perfect combination for kids of all ages. 1985 was a big year for the group from a career perspective. First, they released their next album, King of Rock, which further solidified their sound with the songs King of Rock and Can You Rock It Like This. They were then the only hip-hop act to perform at Live Aid, which is kind of shocking. They followed that up with an appearance in the hit movie Crush Groove. 1986 saw their biggest success with one of the most important albums of the 80s, Raising Hell. The album was produced by Rick Rubin, who had a major role in one of the most important songs of all time. The album was almost done when they decided to do just one more song to pique interest from their fans who had liked the hard rock sounds of King of Rock and Rockbox. So, after some discussion, they fell upon the idea of doing the song Walk This Way from Aerosmith. Originally, they were going to just sample the song, but Rick and Jam Master Jay wanted to redo the song completely. So, they put out the call to Aerosmith to gauge a little interest. At first, there wasn't any. What has to be remembered is that in 1985, no one actually liked Aerosmith. Known as the Toxic Twins at that point, Aerosmith's Steven Tyler and Joe Perry were looked at as part of a group whose heyday was in the 1970s and had, to be nice about it, a lot of drug, alcohol, and other internal band issues. I was actually being nice about that. It was actually pretty brutal at that time. In fact, at that point, they were done as a band. Even with their careers in freefall, though, Steven and Joe didn't want to do the song because they hated hip-hop. To them, and honestly a lot of other artists, hip-hop was taking their songs, using them without paying the artists and making money off of them. The Toxic Twins absolutely wanted no part of that. Rick convinced them to come to the studio to, work some things out. Once they saw how Jam Master Jay could cut the record precisely where he wanted the beat to be at will on the turntables, they were fascinated, and they became hooked. And then they wanted in on the collaboration. The music video also became iconic. The video unfolds with both acts on opposite sides of a wall, and then once Run DMC starts rapping loud to the beat, Steven breaks through the wall with a mic stand. Then, of course, everybody gets up on a concert stage together as a show of solidarity, breaking down the barriers of both rock and hip-hop cultures, and everybody sings Kumbaya and life goes on. Probably not. But, Rumor has it that Steven couldn't break down the wall at first, but they left that part in the final cut. The song, the album, and the music video all became huge hits, along with becoming icons in 80s music. It also gave Aerosmith their career back as the band got back together, started putting out hit songs like Love in an Elevator, Dude Looks Like a Lady, Angel, Jaded, among many, many, many others. After the success of Raising Hell, Run DMC put out Tougher Than Leather and Down with the King, but by then, the sound that the group had pioneered had already changed, and honestly, so did they. The three guys started to not get along, and they started to go off in different directions musically. Run actually became a minister, while Jay became a producer, producing the group Onyx, who had the hit song at the time, Slam. Jay also apparently became a drug dealer, according to court records now unearthed. In 2002, Jam Master Jay was shot and killed in his recording studio in Queens, New York, in what prosecutors said was a revenge killing after Jay had pulled out of a drug deal. His murder was finally solved almost 20 years later, as two men were convicted for his murder on February 27, 2024. Run DMC was one of the most influential hip-hop groups of all time. They influenced later rock rap acts like Korn, Kid Rock, Limp Bizkit, The Prodigy, and others. They were the first hip-hop act on American Bandstand, the first hip-hop act to earn a gold record with the record Run DMC, a platinum album with King of Rock, and a multi-platinum album with Raising Hell. They were also the first hip-hop group to get played on MTV, and they were the first hip-hop act to be nominated for a Grammy Award. The debut single by one of rap music's pioneering icons, Run DMC's It's Like That, and That's the Way It Is, released on March 12th, 1983. And that is it for the Music History In-Depth podcast for March 12th through the 18th. Thanks for listening.